Hi, boys and girls. So we're going to move on to the next part of what is called the Road to the Revolution. And this is the events that were happening in the colonies before we became our own country. And Massachusetts is really famous and really important because some of the most important events happened right here in Massachusetts. So that's what we're going to focus on. And this next one is a really interesting part of history, and it's called the Boston Massacre. So if you're not sure what a massacre is, it's a really sad word. It just means when a group of innocent people are killed, and it's usually by soldiers or police or somebody who's in charge. That's what that word means. So this is the story of the Boston Massacre. So in the previous slideshows, we learned a couple of things: that King George and Parliament passed some new tax laws, and the tax laws they made were to pay for the cost of the French and Indian War and the cost of keeping the soldiers in the colonies. So the colonists were really angry because they had to send their money over to King George III, and they were angry that they had these new taxes. They were also angry that King George and the Parliament made the laws without giving them a chance to vote on the laws. So here's some of the new tax laws. The first one was called the Sugar Act, and remember that word means tax. And the Sugar Act was passed in 1764, which is only a few years after the end of the French and Indian War. And then the very next year was the Stamp Act, which was a tax on all things that had to do with paper or printed material. Those were the first two. So colonists get very angry, and they decide to organize themselves. And what that means is, that doesn't mean they go clean their bedrooms. What it means is they start to become groups, and their groups plan out different protests because they want to let the king and the parliament know that they think these laws are unfair and they don't want to pay them. So these protesters, one of the more famous ones, are called the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty are a group that are people from Boston. They're made up of all different types of people. There were craftsmen, there were lawyers, there were different people who lived mostly in Boston, but in surrounding towns as well. And they became an organization that organized protests to let the king know how they felt. And the Sons of Liberty had some super famous people. These are actors dressed up as the Sons of Liberty, by the way. They're not real. The Sons of Liberty, there were people like Samuel Adams was a member of the Sons of Liberty, and John Hancock and Paul Revere. Some famous names in history were part of this group, and they kind of had to operate in secret. So we'll learn more about them in another slideshow. But this starts to happen in the colonies, that the people organize themselves to protest. So they organized protests. This is a little cartoon of what it would have looked like, perhaps, with their arguing against the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and this is the Tea Act, which we haven't talked about yet, but that's coming up. So that's what's happening in the colonies, and people are getting more and more angry. So one night, the date is March 5th in 1770. You can see it right here. That's the day that it happens. The tensions, and that means the anger and the frustration, grows between the colonists who live in Boston and the soldiers who were stationed here. And remember, these soldiers were left behind after the French and Indian War to protect the land and to help the people. But now they're getting frustrated with each other because these soldiers represent the king. And the colonists are angry at the king. Now, he's all the way over there in England. So they take out their anger on his soldiers. So one night, March 5th in 1770, a crowd of colonists gathers in downtown Boston, and they start to yell insults at the soldiers. And it's a small group of soldiers. There was 8 or 9 of them. They were out on patrol. That means they were kind of walking around like the police do, making sure everything was safe and people were following the laws. And they were out on patrol, and this crowd of people gathered. And the crowd is angry at the tax laws, and the crowd begins to throw things. So it's March, so there was snow on the ground. They start to throw things like snowballs and rocks and hunks of ice. And some of the crowd come, you can see here, with big sticks, And you can see in this picture, this is a sketch somebody made, a snowball. So this crowd is gathering and they start throwing things and yelling at the soldiers. So this goes on for a few hours, and the soldiers are getting nervous. The crowd gets bigger, more and more people come, the crowd grows, and this word says they get more agitated. That means they get angry. So this crowd grows and they're throwing things, and they're yelling, and the soldiers are scared, and it gets really scary. There are some people who try to calm things down, and one of them was some British soldiers tried to calm things down. Some colonists tried to calm things down, but the feelings of the crowd overtake um, the situation, and some pushing and shoving starts. And this teenager, this 17-year-old boy, gets close to the soldiers, and one of the soldiers hits him with his gun. And then suddenly somebody fires a shot into the crowd, and people don't really know who fired that first shot. They don't know if the soldiers were told to fire a shot. Most people think the soldiers were never told to fire into the crowd. Most people think that they were scared and nervous. They fired into the crowd. Some think that somebody in the crowd was yelling fire, like they wanted them to fire the guns. But once one soldier fires the gun and shoots into the crowd, the other soldiers get even more scared and they start to fire their guns as well. And so suddenly, what was a protest has now become a fight. Now, the colonists didn't have guns. This is a sketch of what it may have looked like. This is downtown Boston. You can actually go to this spot, and they've got a little memorial there. But this is what somebody's picture of the soldiers lined up here, this small group of soldiers and this group of colonists. And so they fire into the crowd, and this scares everybody. It even scares the soldiers. Sadly, 5 colonists died. So this is a picture of one of the colonists. His name is Crispus Attucks. He was the first one to die, and he's kind of famous because he was African American, yet he was a free man. There were still slaves at this time in the northern colonies, but he was a free man, and he was African American, and he was part of the crowd. And sadly, he was the first one to die. And so some of the other men die that day, and others are carried away and they die from their wounds within a few days. But in a few days, there's 5 deaths. And this event becomes known as the Boston Massacre. And it happened on March 5th, 1770. This is a very famous sketch. I had to blow it up so you could really see it. This sketch was made by Paul Revere, and it's an etching. It means he carved it. Paul Revere was a silversmith. He was a business owner. He was an amazing person, and he was also a good artist. So he made this picture, and he made copies of it, and it got sent all over the 13 colonies. And this picture is sort of how people learned about what had happened. Because remember, there's no internet, there's no TV news, there's nothing like that. There are newspapers, but they don't come out very often. And this picture becomes very popular. And you'll see this picture a lot when you learn about the Boston Massacre. But what's interesting about this picture is that it's not 100% true. Because although it's hard for you to see, it shows this group of colonists, and it looks like they are just here's the colonists, that they're just standing around. It doesn't show that they were throwing things and that they were pushing themselves into the soldiers. It also doesn't show that it makes it look like, if you look over here, it makes it look like the leader of the group of soldiers is telling them to fire. And historians know that that probably didn't happen. So this is a famous picture, but it's not 100% accurate. So what happened after that was there was a trial, and the soldiers who fired into the crowd had to go to a trial. And in the end, they were found guilty of shooting people, but they were also, although they were guilty of that, they were kind of given a break, I guess I would say, because they fired their guns in self-defense. So that's just an introduction to the Boston Massacre, and there's so much more out there. On Wednesday we'll learn some more, and then there's another video that you can watch, which is a slideshow made by a different person. He goes fast, and he includes more information than I included, but you might be interested in watching that as well. Once you're done watching the videos, you're going to fill out the 3 things I learned chart and hit submit for your teacher.